Smash that subscribe button before the steel doors slam shut. Like the video if you can handle the truth, and drop a comment if you think you could survive 1 week behind these walls. The red emergency light flashed against concrete walls as alarms tore through the silence at 5:12 a.m. Inside the special housing unit of a federal Supermax prison, a corrections officer lay motionless beside a stainless steel food slot. The breakfast tray had spilled across the floor, powdered eggs smeared against gray cement, a slice of bread flattened under a boot print, lukewarm oatmeal bleeding into the cracks. In America's most secure federal facilities, meals are routine, predictable, controlled. But this morning, breakfast triggered lockdown. The officer, Daniel Hargrove, had been assigned to Tier C, the solitary range reserved for inmates who couldn't function anywhere else. Terror suspects, organized crime leaders, men whose names had once dominated headlines across the United States and Europe. Hargrove was careful. He had worked Supermax for 9 years. He knew never to stand directly in front of the slot, never to trust silence, never to assume compliance. And yet, he was on the ground. Not dead, but unconscious. A swelling bruise forming along his temple. The tray cart stood abandoned in the corridor, 20 identical compartments holding identical meals. Every tray sealed. Every portion measured to regulation standards set by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Calories calculated. Salt restricted. Utensils swapped for flexible plastic. On Tier C, even a spoon could become a weapon. Warden Elias Monroe arrived within minutes. Tall, composed, former military. His reputation was built on control. Nothing chaotic survived long under his command. He surveyed the scene without raising his voice. Camera review. Now. Because in Supermax, there are no blind spots. Or at least, there shouldn't be. The inmate in cell C-17 stood behind reinforced glass as officers restrained him. His name was Victor Salazar, a former cartel logistics coordinator extradited from Mexico 5 years earlier. He had adjusted to solitary with unnerving calm. No outbursts, no fights, no infractions. Until breakfast. The preliminary report claimed Salazar had jammed the food slot as Hargrove opened it. When the officer leaned closer, the slot snapped outward with force. Metal against skull. Simple. Mechanical. Brutal. But Monroe didn't buy simple. Because food slots don't snap. They are controlled from the outside. Which meant either equipment failed, or procedure did. And procedure failures in Supermax are rarely accidents. As medical staff wheeled Hargrove away, Monroe ordered a full review of the morning meal cycle. From kitchen prep to tray delivery. Because in a prison where every gram of food is logged, any disruption means something moved out of place. And in Supermax, nothing moves without consequence. The kitchen sat 2 floors below ground level, sealed behind reinforced steel doors. Inmates assigned to food service were classified low-risk, non-violent offenders nearing sentence completion. Even they operated under constant surveillance. Breakfast that morning had been standard rotation: powdered scrambled eggs, fortified oatmeal, 1 slice of wheat bread, and diluted apple beverage. No metal, no glass, no loose packaging. Monroe walked the line of stainless steel counters as staff replayed footage. At 3:47 a.m., trays were assembled. At 4:10 a.m., trays were sealed. At 4:32 a.m., carts were loaded. Everything routine. But then the warden noticed something small. At 4:29 a.m., a substitute kitchen supervisor, new transfer, adjusted 1 tray. Briefly. His body blocked the camera view for less than 3 seconds. 3 seconds. That tray was assigned to C-17. Victor Salazar. Monroe paused the footage. Zoom. The image sharpened. Nothing obvious. But the lid alignment looked slightly off. Barely noticeable. Enough to matter. By 8 a.m., the entire facility was under modified lockdown. Meals were suspended. Inmates remained sealed in their cells. Because food, in a Supermax prison, is more than nutrition. It is leverage, routine, currency, and sometimes, communication. Salazar had not requested medical attention. He had not shouted. He had not resisted extraction. He simply stood in the center of his cell, hands behind his back, watching officers secure the range. Almost as if he expected it, Monroe requested a cell search. Inside C-17, there was nothing unusual at first glance. Concrete slab bed, stainless steel toilet sink unit, a narrow desk molded from the wall. Then an officer found it. Under the oatmeal lid, a thin strip of hardened plastic. No longer than a finger. Sharpened to a rigid edge. Not enough to stab, but enough to wedge. Enough to jam the internal latch mechanism of the food slot if inserted precisely as the door opened. Meaning Salazar didn't force the slot outward. He manipulated it, using something that never should have passed inspection. The question wasn't how he used it. The question was how he got it. Because that plastic didn't exist in standard tray materials. Monroe ordered the tray analyzed. The plastic matched a section from a bulk storage bin used exclusively in the dry goods supply room, accessed only by staff, which meant either negligence or cooperation. By noon, Internal Affairs had isolated the substitute supervisor from the footage, Kevin Draper, age 32, recently reassigned from a medium security facility after requesting transfer. No disciplinary record, clean background. But Financial Review revealed something troubling. 2 weeks earlier, Draper had received a wire transfer from an offshore account. Small enough to avoid automatic red flags. Large enough to matter. And Victor Salazar, before incarceration, had specialized in moving money across borders without detection. The pattern was emerging. But Monroe knew better than to assume motive too quickly. Because in Supermax, manipulation is layered. Salazar didn't attack Hargrove to escape. There is no escape from Supermax. He attacked to send a message. The only question was, to whom? By evening, Hargrove regained consciousness in a hospital wing. Concussion confirmed. Stable condition. He insisted the slot exploded outward. But mechanical testing showed no malfunction. Only obstruction. Inserted deliberately at the exact moment of release. Precision timing. Coordination. Salazar had been in solitary 23 hours a day for 5 years. Minimal human contact. No phone privileges beyond tightly monitored legal calls. So how did he coordinate with Draper? Monroe requested communication logs. That's when they found it. A pattern in meal refusals. Over the past month, Salazar had refused breakfast exactly every third Tuesday. Not random. Predictable. On those mornings, the same kitchen supervisor had signed off on tray reassignment logs. Draper. A silent rhythm hidden inside routine paperwork. Signals disguised as dietary noncompliance. Monroe felt the shift. This wasn't about injuring a guard. It was a systems test. A proof of concept. If a single tray could be altered, if a slot could be manipulated, if a staff member could be influenced, then the most controlled prison in America wasn't as sealed as it believed. At 9:42 p.m., Monroe authorized interrogation of Draper. He denied everything. Said the transfer was a family loan. Said the tray adjustment was minor. Said he never spoke to Salazar. But Supermax cameras don't lie. Footage from 3 weeks earlier showed Draper pausing outside C-17 longer than required. No conversation visible. But Salazar had approached the door. Stood inches from the glass. Unblinking. Communication doesn't always require words. Sometimes it only requires opportunity. And food service provides opportunity every single day. Monroe returned to Tier C that night. The corridor silent. Fluorescent lights humming. He stopped at C-17. Salazar stepped forward. Controlled. Monroe met his eyes through reinforced glass. You planned this. Salazar smiled faintly. In Supermax, smiles are rare. And dangerous. You control the doors, Salazar said evenly. You control the lights. You control the meals. He tilted his head slightly. But you don't control hunger. Monroe felt the weight of that statement. Because hunger inside solitary isn't just physical. It's psychological. Routine is survival. And disrupting it creates pressure. The attack wasn't about violence. It was about leverage. about proving that even here, influence could penetrate concrete. As Monroe turned to leave, an officer approached at a near run. "Warden, you need to see this." Back in the control room, surveillance from the dry goods storage showed something new. At 2:13 a.m., hours before breakfast prep, another staff member had entered the supply room. Not Draper. Someone higher clearance. Someone with unrestricted access. Deputy Warden Claire Hastings. Respected. Veteran administrator. 20 years in federal corrections. The footage showed her removing a bulk plastic container lid. The same type missing a fragment. She exited calmly. No report filed. No documented reason. Monroe stared at the screen. Because if Hastings was involved, this wasn't a bribed supervisor. It was institutional compromise. He rewound the footage again. And again. Looking for doubt. But there was. Clear as steel bars. Which meant Salazar wasn't just testing the system. He had already penetrated it. And when Monroe ordered a discreet audit of Hastings' communication records, what they uncovered changed everything. A series of encrypted emails traced to a legal advocacy organization, one known for challenging solitary confinement practices in federal prisons. An organization that had publicly condemned Monroe's administration. And buried within those messages was a coded phrase referencing nutritional leverage. The same phrase Salazar had whispered through the glass. Hunger is leverage. The implication hit like a locked door slamming shut. This wasn't about escape. It was about exposure. About orchestrating a controlled breach that would ignite national scrutiny over prison food policies and solitary confinement conditions. And if that was true, then the unconscious guard was just the opening move. Monroe leaned back slowly. Because if a deputy warden and a high-profile inmate were aligned, even indirectly, the foundation of the most secure prison in America was already cracking. And somewhere inside Tier C, behind reinforced glass and calculated calorie counts, Victor Salazar was waiting for the next meal cycle. But when they opened the internal audit file on Hastings' office computer, they found a draft document scheduled for release to national media the following morning. A report titled, Systemic Nutritional Deprivation in Federal Solitary Units. And attached to it, photographs of meal trays taken from inside Tier C. Photographs that could only have been captured by someone with administrative access. The timestamp on the scheduled email reads 6 a.m. Breakfast. Lockdown would end by then. Trays would roll again. And if Monroe couldn't stop what was coming, the strictest prison food system in America wouldn't just face scrutiny. It would face exposure. Chapter 2 would begin at sunrise. And someone inside those walls had just declared war without ever leaving their cell. Sunrise inside a Supermax prison does not arrive with warmth. It arrives with procedure. At 5:45 a.m., fluorescent lights snapped on across Tier C. The hum of electricity replaced the illusion of night. Lockdown had held through the dark hours, but routine could not remain suspended forever. In a place built on repetition, even disruption must be scheduled. Warden Elias Monroe stood in the control room overlooking the special housing unit. The draft report from Deputy Warden Claire Hastings was still open on the monitor in front of him. 37 pages detailing calorie counts, portion reductions, disciplinary, Nutritional usage, and alleged psychological impacts of food restriction in solitary confinement. Photographs of trays, gray, colorless meals framed like evidence in a criminal trial. And the email was set to send at 6 a.m. Breakfast. Monroe checked the time, 5:52. 8 minutes. He had already ordered IT to suspend Hastings' external network access, but encrypted drafts could be auto-routed through secondary servers. If she anticipated interference, she would have built redundancy into the release. Claire Hastings was not reckless. She was strategic. And somewhere inside cell C-17, Victor Salazar understood that strategy perfectly. Monroe replayed the footage in his mind, Hastings removing the plastic bin lid from storage at 2:13 a.m. The fragment that became a tool. The tool that jammed the slot. The slot that injured a guard. A controlled incident. Non-lethal. Dramatic enough to trigger internal investigation. timed precisely before the scheduled publication of a report condemning prison food practices. It was engineered outrage. But Monroe needed proof of coordination, not coincidence. At 5:58 a.m., alarms chirped softly across the system. Meal service protocol initiating. The carts began moving. "Hold Tier C," Monroe ordered. The lieutenant hesitated. "Sir, holding breakfast after a lockdown extends grievance exposure." "I'm aware." At exactly 6 a.m., Hastings' office computer pinged. The email failed to send. Network access denied. For a brief second, Monroe felt relief. Then a second alert flashed. External transmission complete. Different server. Different device. Hastings hadn't relied on her office terminal. She had used a personal encrypted tablet connected through an internal maintenance Wi-Fi channel, one typically restricted to contractors. By 6:04 a.m., 3 national newsrooms had received the report. By 6:07 a.m., one investigative journalist had already acknowledged receipt. Monroe's jaw tightened. This was no longer internal containment. This was national exposure. Inside cell C-17, Victor Salazar sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, untouched breakfast slot still sealed. He hadn't requested his tray. He was waiting. Monroe ordered immediate detainment of Deputy Warden Hastings. 2 officers escorted her from her office without incident. She did not resist. She did not argue. She simply asked, "Did it send?" No denial. No panic. Just confirmation. In the interrogation room, Hastings sat upright, composed. 20 years in corrections had hardened her posture but not her conviction. "You compromised a security protocol," Monroe said evenly. "I exposed one," she replied. "You facilitated an assault." "I facilitated evidence." Monroe slid the printed draft across the table. "You used an inmate to create an incident." "I documented systemic issues that were already there." "You coordinated with Salazar." She met his gaze directly. "I never spoke to him." That wasn't the same as saying she hadn't signaled him. Because communication in Supermax does not require dialogue. It requires predictability, meal cycles, refusal patterns, staff assignments. Hastings had overseen dietary modifications for disciplinary units the previous quarter. She knew which inmates were most articulate, most legally savvy, most capable of understanding optics. Victor Salazar had once orchestrated multi-million-dollar logistics chains across continents. Understanding systems was his specialty. Monroe leaned forward. "You risked lives." "I risked embarrassment," she corrected. "There's a difference." The guard's injury was controlled. The tool was calculated not to puncture skin but to create force. Hargrove's concussion was unfortunate, but survivable. And now the story would not be about one injured officer. It would be about what inmates in solitary were being fed every single day. By 8:30 a.m., media requests flooded federal headquarters in Washington, D.C. Advocacy groups began posting excerpts from the leaked report online. Photographs of bland trays, caloric charts, documentation of restricted commissary access. Headlines formed quickly. Inside America's Supermax food system. Are solitary inmates being nutritionally deprived? Monroe knew the truth was more complicated. Supermax diets were federally regulated. Calorie minimums met national guidelines. Nutritional audits occurred quarterly. But perception shapes narrative faster than policy shapes defense. And Salazar understood narrative. Back on Tier C, breakfast remained undelivered. Inmates began pounding doors in rhythmic protest. Not violent, synchronized. An unusual level of coordination for individuals housed in isolation. Monroe froze. How do they know? Solitary confinement is designed to prevent communication. But sound travels through pipes, through vents, through plumbing. A code could be tapped. A pattern transmitted. Salazar had not acted alone. The refusal schedule over the past month hadn't been isolated to C-17. 3 other inmates on different tiers had refused meals on matching intervals. The pattern wasn't about hunger. It was rehearsal. At 9:12 a.m., an emergency call came from Tier E, another solitary wing. An inmate there had collapsed, claiming dizziness from missed meals during extended lockdown. Medical staff responded immediately. The optics were spiraling. Lockdown had been justified for security. But extended food suspension could now appear retaliatory. Hastings sat quietly in holding, listening to distant alarms echo through concrete. "You think you've lost control," she said when Monroe returned. But this was never about control. It was about forcing oversight. "You endangered officers. And you've been ignoring dietary grievances for years." Monroe felt anger rise, but also something else. Uncertainty. He requested independent verification from federal nutrition auditors. If the report exaggerated claims, he needed proof immediately. But before auditors could arrive, another development shifted the ground. At 10:27 a.m., the journalist who received the report published an online article. Embedded within it was a short video clip. Grainy footage. From inside Tier C. Showing a tray labeled Disciplinary loaf. A dense, compressed food block used in certain infractions. Salazar's cell number was visible in the corner of the frame. The timestamp, 3 weeks earlier. Meaning someone with direct camera access had extracted that footage. Not Hastings. She didn't have clearance for live surveillance export. Only one department did. Security IT. Monroe felt the walls tightening. He ordered immediate audit of surveillance access logs. At 10:46 a.m., they found unauthorized duplication of video files over the past month. Routed through a maintenance login. The same Wi-Fi channel Hastings used to send the report. But the login credentials belonged to someone else. Chief of Security Operations, Martin Keller. Monroe closed his eyes briefly. Keller had been vocal about budget cuts. About understaffing. About federal oversight ignoring on-the-ground realities. If Hastings provided moral justification, Keller provided technical capability, and Salazar provided catalytic incident. 3 points forming a triangle. Not chaos. Coordination. At noon, federal authorities initiated external review of the facility. By early afternoon, protest groups gathered outside the prison gates. Monroe stood alone in the control room, watching live feeds from every tier. He had built his reputation on control. But control is fragile when information leaks. At 2:03 p.m., Keller was detained. Unlike Hastings, he did not remain calm. "You think this is about food?" Keller snapped. "This place breaks people. You know it." "You broke protocol," Monroe replied. "I exposed it." The same word Hastings used. Exposed. The language of whistleblowers. But whistleblowing doesn't usually involve orchestrating a staged assault. Unless the goal is to force urgency. Back on Tier C, officers finally resumed meal service under heavy escort. When Salazar's tray slid through the slot, he examined it carefully. Standard portion. No modifications. He didn't eat immediately. He waited. Monroe walked to C-17 personally. "You got what you wanted," Monroe said through the glass. Salazar looked up slowly. "I got attention. You manipulated staff. You built a system that rewards silence. You risked lives." Salazar tilted his head. "You feed men in boxes for 23 hours a day. Don't pretend risk is new." Monroe studied him. "You think this changes your situation?" Salazar gave the faintest smile. "It already has." And he was right. Because at 4:15 p.m., federal oversight officials announced a temporary suspension of disciplinary loaf usage pending review. At 5 p.m., an emergency congressional inquiry was scheduled. And at 6:30 p.m., Monroe received a confidential call from Washington. They were considering administrative leave for facility leadership during investigation. Including him. The architect of order. Potentially removed because of a coordinated breach centered on breakfast. But the most chilling update arrived just before nightfall. IT completed deeper forensic analysis of the encrypted communications between Hastings and the advocacy organization. Buried within metadata was an additional scheduled release. Not to media. to an international human rights consortium based in Europe, set to deploy in 72 hours, containing expanded documentation, including internal memos Monroe had never seen. Documents criticizing cost-cutting measures that reduced fresh produce allocation across federal facilities. Memos signed not by Hastings, but by someone above Monroe's rank, which meant the leak didn't stop at this prison. It climbed higher, and if those documents surfaced, the scandal would widen beyond one Supermax facility. Monroe returned to Tier C one last time before lights out. The corridor was silent again. Salazar stood at the back of his cell, tray empty now. "You're not done," Monroe said quietly. "Smash that subscribe button before the steel doors slam shut."